That confrontation occurred on the night of March 28th. Several servants heard raised voices coming from the drawing room where Benjamin and Catherine had been talking privately. Benjamin's voice carried anger and disgust. Catherine's responses were quieter, controlled, impossible to distinguish through the closed doors. The following morning, Benjamin was gone. His belongings had been removed from his guest room. His horse was missing from the stable. Catherine explained to Thomas, who was too confused to question the sudden departure, that Benjamin had received an urgent telegram calling him back to the university for an important examination. She showed Thomas a telegram that she claimed had arrived during the night, though none of the servants recalled any messenger coming to the manor. The family accepted this explanation without investigation. Benjamin's letters home over the following weeks, sent from various locations across Virginia and Tennessee, revealed a young man in severe psychological distress. He wrote about nightmares that prevented sleep. He mentioned seeing things at the manor that had destroyed his faith in human decency. He made cryptic references to knowledge that he carried alone, unable to share with family members who would never believe him. His final letter, dated April 16, 1913, and mailed from Knoxville, Tennessee, stated his intention to travel to Harlan County to speak with authorities about matters of a serious criminal nature involving his brother's household. He wrote that he had spent weeks gathering courage for this action, and that he could no longer remain silent about what he knew. Benjamin Lambert disappeared 2 days later. His horse was found wandering near the Tennessee-Kentucky border. His body was never recovered. With Benjamin gone and no investigation into his disappearance beyond the family's acceptance of Catherine's vague explanations about his choosing to travel west, Catherine's confidence grew throughout the spring and summer of 1913. The nightly sessions resumed with increased frequency and duration. Dorothy Kent's letters to Elma Jones from this period documented a systematic escalation that went beyond anything the servants had previously endured. Catherine had begun including herself directly in the sessions, rather than merely observing and instructing. She required the servants to bathe her in her private chambers, a process that extended for hours and involved intimate touching that went far beyond the normal duties of a lady's maid. She would recline in the copper bathtub while 2 or 3 women attended to her, providing explicit instructions about where and how to touch her body, speaking in clinical terms about female anatomy and pleasure as though conducting an educational lecture. These bathing sessions occurred 3 to 4 times weekly, always late at night when Thomas lay unconscious in his separate wing. Catherine had developed a rotation system, selecting different combinations of servants for each session. She took notes afterward in her leather journal, comparing the women's compliance and skill, rating them according to criteria she never fully explained. Catherine also instituted sessions where she would summon male servants to restrain the female staff while she used the carved implements on them. The men were required to hold the women in position while Catherine applied the objects, creating scenarios of complete control where the victims had no possibility of escape or resistance. These sessions combined physical restraint with the use of the intimate implements, escalating the humiliation and violation beyond what the women had previously endured. By August, Catherine had introduced new elements to her practices. Dorothy's letter from that month, written in language that struggled to describe what she had witnessed, mentioned objects Catherine had acquired from sources the servants could not identify, carved implements of ivory and polished wood designed for intimate use. Catherine required the servants to use these objects on each other while she observed, sometimes participating, always documenting the sessions with her camera. She had also begun creating a hierarchy among the household staff. Certain women became favorites, receiving better sleeping quarters, small gifts of jewelry or fabric, and occasional evenings free from summons. Others fell from favor and found themselves subjected to increasing humiliation and longer sessions. Catherine used this system to maintain control, fostering competition and resentment among the servants that prevented them from organizing any collective resistance. One practice Catherine instituted involved extended sessions where she would require 3 or 4 servants simultaneously. These gatherings lasted until dawn, with Catherine orchestrating elaborate scenarios that forced the servants into degrading positions and acts. She spoke throughout in her calm, instructional tone, treating the servants as objects for her experimentation rather than as human beings with dignity or agency. The servants who endured these sessions existed in a state of exhausted terror. They slept poorly, startled at every sound that might signal a summons to Catherine's chambers. They avoided each other during daylight hours, unable to meet each other's eyes, ashamed of what they had been forced to do and witness. 2 more housemaids attempted to leave in July and August, and both found themselves unemployable in Harlan County after Catherine spread carefully worded rumors about their moral character and unreliability. The Lambert family's power in eastern Kentucky was absolute. Catherine's word ended careers and reputations. Every merchant, every employer, every landlord understood that crossing the Lambert family meant economic ruin. The servants who remained at the manor understood they were trapped, not only by their immediate need for wages, but by the impossibility of escaping Catherine's reach, even if they fled. Dorothy's September letter revealed something that added another layer of horror to the situation. Catherine had begun making comments during the sessions about her desire to expand her activities beyond the manor's household staff. She spoke about the possibility of bringing in young women from the tenant farming families who rented land from the Lambert Timber Company. She mentioned daughters of the mill workers, girls from poor families who would have no power to refuse if approached with offers of employment or educational opportunities. Thomas remained unconscious through all of this, his health deteriorating under the continued administration of narcotics. His father visited monthly and expressed concern about his son's condition, but Catherine deflected all questions with explanations about ongoing medical treatment and the need for extended rest. Dr. Brennan came periodically, noted Thomas's symptoms, and said nothing about his suspicions. No one intervened. No one investigated. Catherine continued her practices without consequence, protected by wealth, family name, and the silence of those who knew the truth but lacked the power to speak it. On September 14, 1913, William Lambert Sr. summoned Dr. Horace Brennan to the manor with instructions to conduct a thorough examination of Thomas, regardless of Catherine's objections. The elder Lambert had visited his son the previous day and found him in a state of complete mental collapse, unable to recognize his own father or speak in coherent sentences. Thomas had been awake but unreachable, his eyes vacant, his body trembling. Brennan arrived at the manor before noon and found Thomas in his bedroom, lying atop the covers, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling. The examination revealed symptoms that confirmed what Brennan had suspected for nearly a year. Pupils contracted to pinpoints even in the dim bedroom light. Heart rate dangerously slow, skin cold and clammy, breathing shallow. These were not the signs of insomnia or business-related stress. This was acute narcotic poisoning sustained over months. When Brennan confronted Catherine in the hallway outside Thomas's room, she maintained her composure initially, repeating her claims about prescribed sleeping remedies. But Brennan had reached the limit of his professional tolerance for the situation. He informed her that he would be searching her chambers for evidence of the substances she had been administering, and that she could either grant permission or he would return with the county sheriff and a warrant. Catherine's face remained expressionless, but something shifted behind her eyes. She led Brennan to her private rooms in the east wing without protest, unlocking the door with a key she wore on a chain around her neck. The physician entered chambers he had never before seen, despite his many visits to the manor over the past year. What he found there was documented in his private medical ledger in an entry written that same evening. The entry was composed in Latin, suggesting Brennan's awareness that what he was recording was too disturbing for casual readers. His description included vials of morphine sulfate and laudanum tincture, quantities sufficient to maintain a patient in a drugged state for years. No prescription labels, no pharmacy markings. Catherine had been acquiring these substances through channels Brennan could only guess at. But the narcotics were merely the beginning of his discoveries. In a locked drawer of Catherine's desk, Brennan found the photographs, glass plate negatives and printed images depicting the female servants of the household in various states of undress and in positions that Brennan's medical training allowed him to recognize as sexual in nature. Some images showed 2 or 3 women together. Others included Catherine herself, clearly visible, orchestrating or participating in acts the physician struggled to name, even in Latin. Brennan counted 47 photographs before he stopped looking through them. His ledger entry described several in clinical detail, noting evidence of coercion in the subject's expressions and postures. He also found Catherine's leather journal, filled with dated entries describing sessions with specific servants, complete with her observations about their responses and compliance. She had documented everything with the detached precision of a natural scientist recording experiments. The physician also discovered the carved implements Dorothy Kent had mentioned in her letters, objects clearly designed for intimate use, stored in a velvet-lined box beneath Catherine's bed. Brennan's medical knowledge allowed him to understand their purpose immediately. He gathered the vials of narcotics, a selection of the most explicit photographs, and the journal. Catherine watched him collect these items without speaking, her expression suggesting neither shame nor concern. When Brennan asked her directly why she had done these things, she responded with a question of her own. She asked him whether he truly believed anyone would take the word of a physician over the denial of a Lambert, whether he understood the consequences of attempting to expose secrets that powerful families preferred to keep buried. Brennan left the manor that afternoon carrying evidence of crimes that would have resulted in imprisonment had Catherine been anyone other than who she was. He went directly to William Lambert, Sr.'s residence in town, and presented everything he had found. What happened in the hours that followed would determine whether justice would be served or whether wealth and family name would once again prove stronger than truth. The meeting that took place that evening in William Lambert's library would seal the fate of everyone involved in the scandal, and its outcome would allow Catherine to continue her practices for another 13 years. The meeting in William Lambert, Sr.'s library on the evening of September 14, 1913, included 3 men: the elder Lambert, Horace Brennan, and the family attorney, Silas Crutchfield. Minutes from this meeting were discovered among Crutchfield's archived papers at the University of Kentucky in 1981, part of a collection donated by his grandson, who had no knowledge of their significance. William Lambert opened the discussion by acknowledging what the evidence demonstrated. His daughter-in-law had been systematically drugging his son for over a year, while committing what he termed with obvious discomfort unnatural acts with the female household staff. The photographs and journal entries left no room for doubt or alternative interpretation. Catherine's crimes were documented with her own hand and lens. Crutchfield, who had served as the Lambert family's legal counsel for 23 years, outlined the criminal charges that could be pursued: administering narcotics without license, assault, acts against nature, the period legal terminology for sexual conduct between women, possibly conspiracy in the disappearance of Benjamin Lambert, though that connection would be difficult to prove without a body or witness testimony. Dr. Brennan argued for immediate prosecution. He stated that Catherine posed a continuing danger to the servants and potentially to other young women she might access through the family's connections. He pointed out that the evidence was overwhelming and that a conviction was nearly certain given the photographic documentation and physical evidence he had seized. But William Lambert had different concerns. He spoke for nearly an hour about the consequences of public prosecution. The family name would be destroyed. The timber business, which employed over 200 men and supported their families, would suffer catastrophic damage as investors withdrew and contracts were canceled. Thomas would become an object of public humiliation and pity, his manhood questioned, his judgment mocked. The servants who appeared in the photographs would be exposed and shamed, their chances of decent marriage or employment eliminated. Crutchfield supported this assessment, adding that the trial would become a spectacle covered by newspapers across Kentucky and neighboring states. Every degrading detail would be published. The photographs might even be reproduced as evidence exhibits, spreading Catherine's crimes far beyond the courtroom. He reminded Brennan that Victorian sensibilities meant the servant women would be blamed as much as Catherine, accused of seducing her or failing to resist her advances. The attorney also noted a practical concern. Catherine's family, though not as wealthy as the Lamberts, had significant social connections in Philadelphia and could afford excellent legal representation. A trial might drag on for months or even years. Witnesses would need to testify publicly about intimate acts. The defense would attack their credibility and morals. The outcome, while likely favorable, was not guaranteed. Dr. Brennan protested that allowing Catherine to escape justice would betray the women she had victimized. William Lambert responded that those women would be compensated financially, receiving sums that would provide security their positions as servants never could. They would be relocated to other cities where they could start fresh, free from the shame of public testimony. As for Catherine, William proposed an alternative to prosecution. The family owned a remote hunting lodge in Letcher County, accessible only by a difficult mountain road, miles from the nearest town. Catherine would be exiled there with a minimal staff, provided a living allowance but stripped of freedom and social position. She would essentially be imprisoned without the public scandal of a trial. Crutchfield pointed out the legal complications of this arrangement. Catherine could not be held against her will without charges and conviction. But William noted that Catherine, when presented with the choice between public trial and private exile, would almost certainly choose the latter. She was not insane. She understood consequences. She would accept banishment to avoid the destruction of public exposure. The meeting concluded near midnight. Dr. Brennan had been outvoted, his concerns about justice overruled by concerns about reputation and business. He documented his objections in his medical ledger, but ultimately agreed to the family's decision. The following day, William Lambert presented Catherine with her options. She accepted exile without argument, almost as though she had anticipated this outcome. The servants were paid. The evidence was secured in the family attorney's safe. Thomas began the slow process of withdrawal from narcotics under Brennan's supervision, and Catherine prepared for relocation to the mountains, where, unknown to everyone involved in that library meeting, she would continue her practices with new victims for another 13 years. Catherine arrived at the Letcher County Hunting Lodge in October of 1913, accompanied by Harold and Iris Gabbard, an elderly couple who had worked for the Lambert family for decades. The Gabbards knew nothing of Catherine's history. They had been told only that the young Mrs. Lambert required a peaceful mountain retreat for her health, and that their duties would involve basic household maintenance and meal preparation. The lodge sat at the end of a 6-mile track through dense forest, invisible from any road or neighboring property. Built as a seasonal retreat for hunting parties, it consisted of a main structure with 4 rooms and a separate cabin where the Gabbards would live. The isolation was absolute. In winter, heavy snow made the track impassable for weeks at a time. Harold Gabbard's testimony, given to County Magistrate Vernon Sloan in 1924 and preserved in Sloan's private papers, described Catherine's initial months at the lodge as unremarkable. She spent her days reading, writing letters that Harold carried to the post office in town, and taking walks in the surrounding forest. She treated the Gabbards with courtesy and made no unusual demands. Harold believed she had accepted her exile with grace, perhaps even relief at escaping the pressures of society. Then, in spring of 1914, Catherine made her first request. She asked the Gabbards to hire a local girl to help with household tasks. Iris Gabbard, whose health had begun declining, welcomed the assistance. Harold contacted families living within a few miles of the lodge and found Martha Honeycutt, age 15, whose father farmed a rocky hillside plot barely sufficient to feed his family of 7 children. Martha began working at the lodge in April. Her wages, paid by the Lambert family, were more than her father earned in a month of farming. The arrangement seemed providential for a struggling family. Martha would work Monday through Friday, sleeping at the lodge, returning home on weekends. After 3 weeks, Martha returned home on a Friday evening and refused to go back. Her younger sister Edith, who later gave testimony to Magistrate Sloan, described finding Martha in their shared bed that night, curled into a ball, her body shaking. Martha would not speak about what had happened at the lodge. She showed bruises on her arms and thighs. She flinched when anyone touched her. When their father, Samuel Honeycutt, walked to the lodge the following Monday to demand his daughter's wages and an explanation for her condition, Harold Gabbard met him at the property line with a rifle. Harold informed him that Miss Lambert had sent instructions through the Lambert family attorney that no visitors were to be permitted on the property under any circumstances. If Samuel attempted to approach again, Harold would contact the county sheriff and have him arrested for trespassing on Lambert land. Samuel Honeycutt never saw his daughter's wages. Martha never spoke about her 3 weeks at the lodge. By autumn, she had married a man 20 years her senior and moved to another county. She died in childbirth in 1917, age 18. Over the following 8 years, at least 4 other local girls were employed at the lodge for brief periods. Lillian Prather, who worked there in 1917 when she was 16, Anna Shepard in 1919, Ruth Combs and Sarah Blandon in 1920 and 1921. All came from poor farming families. All worked at the lodge for weeks rather than months. All left abruptly without collecting final wages. None of them reported what Catherine had done to them. The pattern established at Lambert Manor had continued in the mountains. Catherine required the girls to participate in the same practices she had forced upon the household servants: the bathing rituals, the forced acts between her servants, the use of implements, the photography and documentation. But unlike the manor servants who had each other for silent companionship in their shared trauma, these mountain girls endured Catherine's attentions alone, isolated in the lodge with only the elderly Gabbards nearby, a couple who saw nothing and suspected nothing because Catherine conducted her sessions behind locked doors while Harold and Iris slept in their separate cabin. The girls returned to their families, damaged and silent, carrying shame they believed was somehow their own fault, lacking the language or framework to understand that what had been done to them constituted criminal assault. Their families, desperate for the wages Catherine offered, sometimes pressured them to return to the lodge despite their obvious distress. Poverty made monsters possible. Lillian Prather was 23 years old, married, and the mother of 2 children when she walked into County Magistrate Vernon Sloan's office in May of 1924. She had been planning this visit for 7 years, since she was 16, and had spent 5 weeks working at Catherine's lodge. The decision to finally speak had taken every bit of courage she possessed. Sloan, who had served as Letcher County Magistrate for 6 years, listened to Lillian's account and took notes in a leather-bound journal he kept separate from his official case files. These private notes, discovered when his estate was settled in 1948, provided the only detailed record of what Lillian disclosed that afternoon. She described arriving at the lodge in June of 1917, grateful for employment that paid more in a week than her father's farm produced in a month. For the first 3 days, her duties consisted of ordinary housework. Catherine treated her politely, almost kindly. Then, on the 4th night, Catherine summoned her to her private bedroom after the Gabbards had retired to their cabin. What followed over the next 5 weeks matched exactly what Catherine had done to the servants at Lambert Manor a decade earlier. The forced bathing rituals that lasted hours, the requirement that Lillian undress and allow Catherine to touch her intimately while providing clinical commentary, the use of implements that caused pain. Catherine's calm, instructional tone throughout, as though teaching rather than assaulting. Lillian told Sloan that she had endured these sessions because she feared losing the wages her family desperately needed. She had tried once to refuse a summons, and Catherine had withheld her meals for 2 days, keeping her locked in a storage room until she agreed to comply. After that, Lillian had submitted to whatever Catherine demanded, counting the days until she could leave. Sloan's notes indicated he found Lillian's testimony credible and deeply disturbing. He contacted the other girls who had worked at the lodge, using county records and conversations with local families to identify them. 3 of the 4 agreed to speak with him privately. Their accounts corroborated Lillian's in every significant detail. Catherine had assaulted each of them repeatedly during their brief employment, using the same methods and even similar language across years of isolated abuse. Armed with testimony from 4 victims describing a consistent pattern of criminal behavior, Sloan had sufficient evidence for prosecution. He documented his findings and prepared to approach the Lambert family through their legal representation, intending to demand Catherine's arrest and trial. But before he took that step, he received an invitation to meet privately with Silas Crutchfield at the attorney's office in Harlan. The meeting occurred on June 3, 1924. Sloan's notes from that evening described what transpired. Crutchfield acknowledged that Catherine had committed acts that constituted criminal offenses. He did not dispute the testimony or question the victim's credibility. Instead, he presented Sloan with a practical assessment of what prosecution would require and what it would achieve. The trial would expose the victims to public scrutiny and shame. Their names would appear in newspapers. Defense attorneys would question their morals and motivations. The community would judge them harshly for participating in acts that proper women should have died rather than endure, regardless of coercion or circumstances. Catherine, meanwhile, would hire the finest legal representation available. The Lambert family's resources were essentially unlimited. The trial might last months. The outcome, while likely favorable given the evidence, was not certain. Juries in Kentucky had been known to acquit wealthy defendants, despite overwhelming proof of guilt. Crutchfield then presented an alternative. He placed an envelope on his desk containing $2,000, enough money to resolve Sloane's substantial personal debts and fund his children's education. He explained that the Lambert family preferred to handle this matter privately, as they had handled Catherine's previous offenses. She would remain in exile at the lodge under stricter supervision. The victims would receive financial compensation. Justice of a sort would be served without the destruction that public prosecution would bring to everyone involved. Sloane took 3 days to make his decision. His notes revealed the reasoning that led him to accept the money and abandon prosecution. He wrote that he had weighed the certain harm that a trial would cause the victims against the uncertain benefits of convicting Catherine. He admitted that financial considerations influenced him. He concluded that sometimes compromise served the greater good better than rigid adherence to legal principle. He was wrong, but by the time he understood that, it was too late. Catherine remained at the lodge. The abuse continued, and Sloane carried the weight of his moral failure until his death in 1947. Catherine died at the Letcher County Lodge on February 9, 1926, from pneumonia that developed after she spent hours walking in a winter rainstorm. She was 33 years old. Harold Gabbard found her unconscious in her bed the following morning, her breathing shallow and labored. By the time he could fetch a physician from town, navigating the muddy track in freezing conditions, Catherine had stopped breathing. The Lambert family arranged for her burial in an unmarked grave on the lodge property. No funeral service was held. No obituary appeared in any newspaper. The family's instructions to Crutchfield were explicit. Catherine's death should pass without public notice or record. She would simply disappear from history as though she had never existed. Thomas Lambert, who had recovered from his addiction but never remarried, received news of Catherine's death with no visible emotion. He had not seen or communicated with her since October of 1913. He never spoke her name again. When he died in 1948 at age 62, he left his considerable estate to charitable organizations supporting education for poor children in eastern Kentucky. His will made no mention of Catherine. The lodge remained empty for 26 years after Catherine's death. The Lambert family maintained minimal upkeep, sending workers occasionally to prevent complete decay, but no one lived there or used it for its original hunting purpose. The building became known locally as a place to avoid, though few people remembered why it carried such an atmosphere of wrongness. In 1952, the Lambert timber holdings were sold to a larger corporation based in Ohio. The new owners commissioned surveys of all properties and decided to demolish the remote hunting lodge to clear the land for potential development. Construction workers arrived in August to begin dismantling the structure. On their third day of work, the crew discovered something unusual. The floor in Catherine's former bedroom sat slightly higher than floors in other rooms, suggesting a void beneath. When they pried up the boards, they found a sealed room approximately 8 feet square, accessible only through the hidden panel. Inside were wooden crates containing photographic equipment, hundreds of glass plate negatives carefully stored, and boxes of written materials. One worker, Eugene Faulkner, examined several of the negatives by holding them to light and immediately understood he had found something disturbing. The images depicted young women in various states of undress, engaged in acts he recognized as sexual. Some negatives showed an older woman, presumably Catherine, directing or participating. Faulkner reported the discovery to his foreman, who contacted the Letcher County Sheriff. Within hours, representatives from the Lambert family's legal firm arrived at the site. What followed was a negotiation familiar to everyone who had encountered Catherine's crimes over the previous 4 decades. The workers were offered payment for their silence. Most of the evidence was removed and destroyed. The matter was resolved quietly without investigation or publicity. But Eugene Faulkner kept several items: a dozen glass plate negatives, written pages from Catherine's documentation describing her practices in explicit detail. He stored these materials in his attic for 24 years, uncertain what to do with them, but unwilling to let them disappear completely. In 1976, Faulkner's daughter discovered the materials while helping her elderly father downsize to a smaller home. She was completing a graduate degree in Appalachian social history at the University of Kentucky and immediately recognized their historical significance. She donated them to the Kentucky Historical Society with her father's permission, including a written statement from Faulkner describing how and where he had found them. These materials, combined with Elma Jones's letters, discovered 2 years later in Ohio, Dr. Brennan's medical ledger, Magistrate Sloan's private notes, and testimony from survivors who finally felt safe enough to speak decades after their trauma, revealed the full scope of Catherine's depravity and the conspiracy that protected her for 13 years. The servants Catherine victimized at Lambert Manor scattered across the country, most dying without ever speaking publicly about what they had endured. The mountain girls she assaulted during her exile lived with their trauma in silence, some taking the truth to their graves. Benjamin Lambert's body was never found, his disappearance never officially solved. The families who had enabled Catherine's crimes through silence, bribery, and legal maneuvering faced no consequences. The lodge site today is forest again, reclaimed by the mountains. Catherine's unmarked grave, if it still exists beneath decades of leaf fall and undergrowth, carries no warning about what she was or what she did. Her name appears in no criminal records, no court proceedings, no official acknowledgement of the lives she destroyed. But the evidence preserved across archives in 3 states tells her story. It stands as testimony to the victims who deserved justice and never received it. It reveals how wealth and power can transform crimes that would destroy ordinary people into secrets that powerful families simply bury deeper. If this story has made you think about the victims whose voices were silenced by money and influence, then click that like button and subscribe. Share Catherine's story. Let it reach people who need to understand that evil doesn't always look like what we expect, that monsters can wear elegant gowns and live in mansions, and that the greatest crimes are often the ones we choose not to see. Before you leave, kindly drop a comment about which part of this story affected you most. These voices from the past deserve to be heard, and your engagement ensures they won't be forgotten. In June of 1912, the Harlan County Courier dedicated its entire front page to what the editor called the most elegant wedding Eastern Kentucky had witnessed in a decade. The bride, Catherine Eloise Lambert, age 19, appeared in a hand-sewn gown imported from Philadelphia. By September, the first servant had fled the estate without collecting her wages. The letter she wrote home would not surface for 66 years. Before we dive into the story, I need you to understand something crucial. Catherine's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the monsters aren't hiding in shadows. They're hosting elegant dinner parties and sleeping in silk sheets. If stories like this matter to you, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there, because these voices from the past deserve to echo across every corner of the world. Now, let's continue with the story. Catherine Eloise Lambert married Thomas Lambert III on June 15, 1912, in a ceremony that drew guests from as far as Louisville and Cincinnati. The Lambert family controlled 3 timber mills and owned over 15,000 acres of mountain forest stretching across Harlan and Letcher counties. Their estate, Lambert Manor, sat on a ridge overlooking the Cumberland River, a 3-story structure of imported stone and native timber that had taken 4 years to complete. The wedding reception lasted 3 days. Local newspapers described tables laden with foods most residents of eastern Kentucky had never tasted. A string quartet traveled from Lexington. The bride wore 3 different gowns across the celebration. Thomas, age 26, had graduated from the University of Virginia with a degree in business and was being groomed to take over the family timber operations from his father. The manor employed a staff of 8 servants who lived in quarters attached to the main house. Head housekeeper Elma Jones, age 34, had worked for the Lambert family for 11 years and had supervised preparations for the wedding with military precision. She had trained the younger housemaids, managed the kitchen staff, and maintained the household accounts. She took pride in her position and had planned to remain with the family until retirement. By September, Elma had submitted her resignation. She left the manor on a Tuesday morning, walking down the long gravel drive, carrying a single carpet bag. She did not collect her final month's wages. She did not provide the customary 2 weeks' notice. She simply left, catching a coach to the rail station in Harlan and purchasing a ticket to Cincinnati, where her younger sister lived. The resignation surprised the Lambert family. Elma had seemed content in her position. She had expressed no complaints about her duties or treatment. When William Lambert Sr. inquired about her sudden departure, she responded with a brief letter stating only that personal circumstances required her immediate relocation and that she wished the family well. What Elma did not mention in that letter, but would describe in painful detail in correspondence to her sister over the following months, was what she had begun to notice in the manor after Catherine's arrival. Small things at first. Catherine's strange requests, the way the younger housemaids had started avoiding certain duties, the fact that Thomas had moved into a separate bedroom barely 4 months into the marriage, claiming he needed quiet for his business work. And then on the night of September 3rd, Elma had witnessed something that made her understand she could not remain in that house another day. The letters Elma Jones wrote to her sister Margaret in Cincinnati between September and December of 1912 were discovered in a cardboard box at the Ohio Historical Society in 1978. A graduate student cataloging a donation of family papers found them tied with string, stored alongside recipe cards and church bulletins. The first letter, dated September 10th, began with an apology for leaving Cincinnati so abruptly and a promise to explain what had driven her from the Lambert estate. Elma described an incident from 3 weeks earlier, late August, when she had descended to the kitchen near 2 in the morning because she could not sleep in the summer heat. She found Catherine standing at the work table in her dressing gown, crushing something white and powdery into a glass of warm milk, using a mortar and pestle from the medicine cabinet. Catherine had startled when Elma entered, nearly dropping the glass. She recovered quickly, explaining with perfect composure that she was preparing a sleeping remedy for Thomas, who had been suffering from insomnia, brought on by the stress of learning the timber business from his father. She said the powder was a harmless herbal preparation recommended by a physician in Lexington. Elma noted in her letter that Thomas had never mentioned insomnia to any of the household staff. He had always been an early riser, energetic and engaged with his work, but in recent weeks, his behavior had changed dramatically. He slept late, sometimes not emerging from his bedroom until noon. When he did appear, he seemed confused and lethargic, moving through the house as though walking through deep water. He forgot conversations from the previous day. He missed important meetings with timber contractors. On September 3rd, Dr. Horace Brennan made an unscheduled visit to the manor. Thomas' father had summoned him after visiting his son and finding him unable to discuss basic business matters or even recall which day of the week it was. Brennan spent an hour examining Thomas in his bedroom while Catherine waited in the hall outside, her face betraying no concern. The physician's private medical ledger, donated to the Kentucky Medical History Archives in 1964 after his death, contained an entry from that date written in careful script. Brennan described symptoms consistent with narcotic poisoning: profound drowsiness extending 12 to 14 hours beyond normal sleep, contracted pupils even in dim light, memory loss and confusion, slurred speech. He suspected morphine or laudanum, but could find no prescription records for either substance. When Brennan questioned Catherine privately in the drawing room, asking if Thomas had access to any medications, or if she had noticed him taking anything unusual, she became defensive. She told him that her husband's condition was a family matter that required no outside interference, that the stress of new responsibilities had simply overwhelmed him temporarily, and that he would recover with rest and her devoted care. Brennan noted in his ledger that he found Catherine's response troubling, but felt unable to pursue the matter further without concrete evidence of wrongdoing. He also wrote with unusual candor for a medical document that he feared professional retaliation from the Lambert family if he made accusations against the bride of their eldest son. What Catherine was doing during the long hours when Thomas lay unconscious in his bedroom, Brennan did not know, But Elma Jones had begun to piece together a pattern that terrified her. The younger housemaids had started appearing at breakfast with dark circles under their eyes, as though they too had lost sleep. Two of them, Sarah Lello and Rebecca Finch, both in their early 20s, had become nervous and withdrawn, flinching when Catherine entered a room. And late at night, Elma had heard sounds coming from the east wing where Catherine's private chambers were located. Footsteps, low voices, once unmistakably a woman weeping. When Elma mentioned these observations to the cook, the older woman had looked at her with frightened eyes and told her that some things in great houses were not the business of the help, and that keeping one's position meant keeping one's silence. But Elma could not keep silent after what she witnessed on the night of September 3rd, when she followed the sound of crying to Catherine's door and saw through the gap what was happening inside that candle-lit room. Elma Jones's letter, dated September 8, 1912, written 3 days after she fled Lambert Manor, contained details she admitted caused her physical illness to recall. She apologized to her sister for the explicit nature of what she was about to describe, but stated that bearing witness to such depravity required documentation, even if the world was not yet ready to believe that a woman of Catherine's social standing could commit such acts. Through the gap in Catherine's chamber door, Elma had seen Sarah Lello and Rebecca Finch, both fully unclothed, positioned on the carpet near the fireplace. Catherine sat in a velvet chair, wearing only her dressing gown, which hung open. She was speaking to the two women in the calm, instructional tone one might use to teach embroidery or French grammar. Catherine was directing them to perform oral acts upon each other, providing specific instructions about technique and duration. When Sarah hesitated, tears streaming down her face, Catherine reminded her in a voice devoid of emotion that servants who refused reasonable requests from their employer would find themselves without positions or references, unable to secure work anywhere in eastern Kentucky where the Lambert name carried weight. Elma watched, frozen in horror, as the two young women complied with Catherine's demands. The scene lasted approximately 20 minutes. Catherine observed throughout, occasionally touching herself beneath the dressing gown, sometimes rising from her chair to adjust the women's positions or to provide closer instruction. At one point, she produced a camera mounted on a wooden tripod and took several photographs, the flash powder illuminating the room in bursts of white light. Catherine also began summoning male servants from the household staff, requiring them to participate in sessions alongside the women. She would orchestrate scenarios involving both male and female servants, directing their interactions while she observed and sometimes participated, treating the entire arrangement as theater staged for her gratification. When Catherine finally dismissed the servants, telling them to dress and return to their quarters, Elma retreated to her own room before they could discover her presence in the hallway. She spent the remainder of the night packing her belongings, and at dawn, she walked away from Lambert Manor forever. But leaving did not end Elma's knowledge of what was occurring in that house. Her sister Margaret had urged her to report what she had witnessed to authorities, but Elma knew the futility of such action. No magistrate in Harlan County would believe the testimony of a housekeeper over the denial of a Lambert bride. Instead, Elma maintained correspondence with one of the remaining servants, a woman named Dorothy Kent, who worked in the kitchen, and who began sending her own letters describing the escalating situation. Dorothy's letter from November 19th, preserved alongside Elma's correspondence, revealed that Catherine had expanded her practices. She now summoned different combinations of the female staff to her chambers several nights each week. The sessions had grown longer and more elaborate. Catherine had begun requiring the servants to simulate intercourse with each other in various positions while she watched and photographed them. She spoke throughout these sessions as though conducting a scientific study, commenting on their responses, and taking notes in a leather-bound journal she kept locked in her desk. One housemaid, Ruth Canfield, age 18, had attempted to refuse a summons in late October. The following morning, Catherine dismissed her without wages or references. Ruth's belongings were left at the end of the manor's long driveway. When Ruth's father, a farmer who rented land from the Lambert Timber Company, attempted to collect his daughter's owed wages, he was informed his lease would not be renewed. The family was forced to relocate to another county. The message to the remaining servants was clear: Compliance meant continued employment, food, and shelter. Resistance meant destitution, not only for themselves, but potentially for their families as well. Most of the housemaids came from poor mountain families who depended on their daughters' wages for survival. They had nowhere to go and no one to help them. Dorothy's December letter mentioned something else that made the situation even more disturbing. Thomas had begun showing signs of slight improvement. On several mornings, he had emerged from his bedroom more alert than he had been in months. Catherine had noticed this development and had increased the dosage of whatever she was putting in his evening meals. Dorothy had watched her crush more of the white powder into his food, ensuring his unconsciousness continued through the nights when she required privacy for her activities in the East Wing. In March of 1913, Thomas's younger brother Benjamin arrived at Lambert Manor for what the family expected would be a brief visit during his spring recess from the University of Virginia Law program. Benjamin was 22 years old, sharp-minded, and devoted to his older brother. He had not seen Thomas since the previous summer before the wedding, when his brother had been vigorous and engaged with the family timber business. The change in Thomas shocked Benjamin. According to a letter Benjamin wrote to a university friend, preserved in the collection of the Virginia Historical Society, he found his brother moving through the manor like a ghost, his speech slow and uncertain, his memory fractured. Thomas could not recall conversations from hours earlier. He seemed confused about basic business matters that had once been second nature to him. Benjamin began asking questions immediately. He interrogated the household staff about Thomas's daily routine, his eating habits, his sleep patterns. He examined the medicine cabinet in Thomas's bedroom and found nothing unusual. He spent evenings sitting with his brother, attempting to draw him into discussion about the timber operations, observing how Thomas struggled to maintain focus for more than a few minutes at a time. Catherine appeared disturbed by Benjamin's presence and his persistent questioning. For 2 weeks after his arrival, the nightly summons to the servants ceased entirely. The housemaids, who had been enduring Catherine's sessions multiple times weekly since September, found themselves suddenly left alone. Dorothy Kent noted this change in a letter to Elma Jones, writing that the reprieve felt temporary, like the calm before worse weather. Benjamin's suspicions began to focus on Catherine herself. He noticed how she controlled Thomas's meals, often preparing his evening plate personally in the kitchen. He observed how she encouraged Thomas to retire early each night, sometimes as early as 7 in the evening. He saw how the servants, particularly the younger women, seemed fearful in Catherine's presence, avoiding eye contact and hurrying from rooms when she entered. On the evening of March 27th, Benjamin confronted one of the housemaids directly. Rebecca Finch had been serving dinner when she dropped a serving dish, shattering it on the floor. As she knelt to clean the pieces, she began crying uncontrollably. Benjamin helped her to her feet and took her aside to the library, closing the door. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. What Rebecca told him was never recorded, but Benjamin's letter to his friend, dated March 28th, suggested he had learned something that fundamentally altered his understanding of his sister-in-law. He wrote that he had discovered evidence of criminal behavior occurring in the manor, acts of such depravity that he struggled to believe them possible from someone of Catherine's background and education. He stated his intention to confront Catherine directly and, if necessary, to contact the county sheriff and demand an investigation.